Barbie Girl.
No, Arms Wide Open by Creed.
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Roger,
And welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
On our search to find the middle.
We're going to give you last week's news today.
That's a slogan we should put on a t-shirt.
Stop touching her!
I am tonight announcing my candidacy.
Taylor Swift.
Look, my biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny.
Having truly rational conversations about controversial issues is risky these days.
Andy, how you doing?
Another day, another dollar.
Just $1. Oh, $1.50.
Oh, look, inflation bites, doesn't it?
I know. I wonder what 50 cent would be in this generation. I've got something for you. So I was cruising the shopping centre, the local Westfield, with my daughter the other day, as a good stay-at-home parent would be doing when it's raining. And I was seated at this cafe, and the tables were really close together, so I could hear. It's one of those ones where you're pretty much sitting next to each other. And usually when this happens, people are pretty good in terms of noise and conversations, right? But I think there was enough ambient noise that the two ladies, so there were two kind of ladies in their kind of like mid to late 20s that were having a coffee catch-up right next to me. And we're talking about, you can reach out and touch them if you want to. Not that I did. And I overheard their whole conversation. And I actually quite like these situations, right? Because, every now and then you start to forget that people are different from you and that there are different people out there that you might not fully understand or appreciate. And so there was a particular conversation that I want to kind of summarize for you to get your opinion on. And the whole thing just left me just really questioning the integrity of female to female relationships. Right? Like it was really funny. So the first part was a specific incident that one of the ladies was talking to another about. So lady one had essentially one of the ladies was driving her partner's car, her boyfriend's car, and he was it sounded like he was quite a bit of a car, like a car nut. He had like a nice car and he really cared about it. And so she wasn't really meant to be driving it, but she did anyway. And she ran over a curb and essentially scratched it all up. And she was talking about this to her friend and saying, how bad it was. And he was so angry with her and it's actually like impacted their relationship. And essentially the other friend said, oh, I've done that plenty of times with my boyfriend's car. And I'll tell you what you need to do when this happens, just start crying. And he'll just take it. He'll just stop yelling at you, and he'll comfort you. And she's like, "Oh, what do you mean?" It's like, "Yeah, they're just so easy. They can't help themselves. If you start crying, they'll just want to make you feel better, and just by doing that, will make them feel useful." I do it all the time, and I was just like, "Oh man, this is some terrible advice," but also quite an interesting thing because I know that I have a confirmation bias in this regard because we've spoken about this before around crying and being used as a tool, especially by women. And this kind of was like, oh yes, I've got a real life example now to tell Andy about it. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of get your opinion on that first thing around like the crying aspect of it.
Right? So can I just ask what was the age of this?
They looked about. I'm going to go with like a mid-20s.
Okay.
So they had like a bit of a
little bit immature, sort of.
Yeah, they had a bit of Gen Z slang, but not quite that Uber slang. But yeah, definitely, I think in their mid-20s.
Because when you said like some sort of coffee catch up, I had like in my mental image was like these two sort of retired or like 60, 70-year-olds. So when you said boyfriend, I just had to clarify. Yeah, I mean, like I have no doubt there's people who do that. Oh, and actually that's something children do, right? So
yeah, well, I'm defensive crying, right? Like they cry before you can tell them off.
Yeah, and so for me, like I see it as a little bit of a sign of immaturity that's kind of the default approach. Whereas I think, if we're talking, let's say a marriage, right, where the relationship is a lot more mature than just, oh yeah, I've got this like boy whipped, so I'll just cry on demand and I can get away with murder sort of thing. Like I don't think that's true of like more sophisticated relationships.
All right. Well, I mean, I don't disagree. And obviously, like the thought, if you have a mental model of, say, a 20-something crying, and then you replace that 20-something with like a 60-year-old woman, of course, it's going to be less effective in some ways. But I mean, I would say like what it challenged me was, right, like it's undeniable that a woman crying has a certain response on men more than it does on other women. And I would kind of, it like challenge me as like, oh yeah, that's really, you know, and I was like, oh, I wouldn't fall for that. But at the same time, it's like you do. And especially more so if it's someone you care about. It almost doesn't matter what's going on. If they're crying, they're crying. And you will respond in a very supportive way, right? Like,
do you know what, like, the dynamic here is like men just don't know how to react. Like, it's just this, oh, what do I do? Like, you know, she's crying. Like, and I think for women, there's maybe, I don't know, maybe there is this, like, there's a bit more intuition about like, well, let's say a friend's crying. Like, what do you do in that situation? Where it's like, men, it's like, fuck, like, what am I supposed to like hug you? Am I supposed to like tell you I was wrong? Like, how do I just give up and concede whatever the cause? Like, how do I approach this while maintaining my, because I haven't changed my mind about whatever it is we were discussing that made you cry. But it's just that, like, I don't know what to do. So I think that's the brain fuck there.
I think so. I mean, I kind of actually recall when I started my first job and I was part of a graduate program, and I really wanted to get to know the other graduates, and because you're kind of stationed in all these different parts of the business and everyone has a bit of a different role. And so I kind of like did this thing where I had a coffee catch up with each of them and asked them how they were going and what their job was, just because I wanted to kind of almost, you know, get to know everyone socially. And I vividly remember when I got to this particular lady that was part of the graduate group, and I, you know, asked her like, "How's it going? You know, are you enjoying it?" And literally, just hearing those words, she like broke down in tears, like proper like tears. And I was just like, exactly what you've described, where I was not expecting that at all, right? And it's like a work setting. I don't know this woman. I definitely don't know her well enough to hug her in a corporate setting or whatever it is, right? Like, I do not know what to do.
So that's like the ultimate like brain fuck. Like, you don't even know what to do in a human to human level when someone cries, but then like overlay that what's appropriate in a workplace.
And what was even worse was that like this came at the same time like the waiter like dropped 2 steaming hot coffees on our table, right? So it's not like we can even just call this quits and like whatever, we've now got these like 2 hot coffees to deal with. But yeah, I just like I was like,
something suddenly came up.
Just can we reschedule when you're less emotional? But yeah, it just those feelings around like, okay, like you don't know them well enough to really embrace or comfort them, and is that what they would want anyway? It's almost like someone vomiting. It's like, give them space. You know, do you need a water? Do you need a towel afterwards?
I think for men, like, it is quite rare to even like that seems to be the default state, that you never cry. And it is this interesting kind of thing to engage with, even as a bit of a, like, it gets brought up in like mental health discussions, all that sort of stuff. But even just as like an emotion, like forget the mental health side or anything like that, but just purely like, this is a thing, an experience I want to go through, almost like sneezing. Like, this is something I want to, and I don't want to let go of, like, almost to enjoy crying, right? Almost to kind of, I don't want to let go. I can stop myself crying in a heartbeat. Like, I just need to like snap out of it and like go and like do some weights or something, go for a jog, right? But like, to actually take almost a form of like pleasure in it, right? And I think that's where like someone like, you know, who we haven't really talked much about on this podcast, but like Jordan Peterson, I feel like he likes crying. Like, I've listened to like audiobooks of him, and he's like pretty much crying like while he's reading the audiobook.
Yeah.
And I feel like he likes working himself up in that to get to that state.
I get that, right? Like, because what I don't get is the child like response of crying, right? Like, when a child, say, falls over and hurts their knee, they cry. Yeah. And actually a lot of people don't lose that. especially women. Like, I know lots of women who, like, if they, for example, I was the other day, like, I saw someone like hit their elbow really hard on like a granite bench and they cried, right? Just for a minute, and they got over it. It wasn't like a big thing, but it was like a pain response. Yeah, like a physical pain response. And that, I was like, I cannot understand that. I literally can't as an adult. But I do understand like this build up of like, like being moved by something incredibly sad. I've never really cried watching movies, but I got really close when I watched I Am Sam. Have you seen that movie?
Is that the one with the daughter? Like the guy's got autism.
He's mentally
something
challenged.
Like that. Yeah.
Sean Penn.
Yeah.
And he's got the haircut for it and everything, so the shoe fits. But anyway, there's this amazing scene, and he's like being cross-examined legally whether he could have custody and whether he's fit to be a parent, and they're like going at him, and he's already cognitively challenged, and then he just breaks down on the stand, and he's like, yeah, my heart of hearts, and he just like breaks down and admits that like maybe like he just like they tear him apart mentally, and he breaks down whether he is good enough to actually care for his daughter, and really what he's saying is like his daughter deserves more than him. But it is heartbreaking, and I remember being in that cinema and everyone was crying, and I felt everything akin to crying except just the tears wouldn't come. But I can understand that because that felt like being so moved by the movie. Like that's exactly what the movies are about, and being drawn into it and feeling the pain of that, that character. That's a good thing, right? That's like one of the highs of being a human. So when you say like Peterson revels in that, whatever, like I get that. Like I understand that, wanting to feel something because you feel alive, right? And feeling like pleasure and pain are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? So I kind of get that. I just don't get the pain response.
I think definitely movies are can do that, but for some reason I'm a softie for musicals. Like I reckon musicals, there's some formula about like the music and the music combined with the story and like the performances and the character development, because I think music can get those emotions out of you, and like in this really almost supercharged way, more than a movie can. So I've definitely like shed tears when watching like a musical, different ones, but you have to allow yourself to do it.
Yeah,
because if you're not in the right headspace, it's not going to happen. So you have to like be like a willing participant in that you're about to cry in
the manipulation of it all, right? Like, yeah. Definitely musicals, right? And I was about to say, like, I'll admit to something that I don't think I have admitted to in the podcast yet, that even though I'm really like, I haven't cried in a lot of the big moments in my life in that way, but there is something about certain songs, and it's not even really like the song has to be lyrically moving, but there's something about when there's a certain type of song and the dramatic nature of the composition, like I can actually break down and cry. It doesn't have to be like, and it's very strange. It's like it's almost like a brown note that makes you poo. Like I have like this thing, like I actually like. Okay, I'll admit one song that has happened to once, and it hasn't happened since, and I've been chasing that high, and it happens every now and then.
Barbie Girl.
No, Arms Wide Open by Creed.
That must have been your when you were a Christian, right?
Before the orgy. But there's something about being a father and this idea of like not being good enough but wanting the best for your child and all this kind of stuff, and like the way it like builds up in a really cheesy ballad and stuff, and like when it hits the notes and it's like, the obscene guitar solo comes in, it's just, there's something that did it. And I remember just like being a mess, like sobbing almost, to Creed of all things, right? Luckily it wasn't Nickelback, because they're kind of the similar bands, aren't they? But yeah, like I get that. But anyway, let's come back to these two girls, right? Because I do think that as much as it was hard to listen to, it did reinforce certain things that, number one, women know what they're doing with their feminine power. And number two, men in that way, they are right, that men are easily manipulated in that very specific way. I do agree.
Well, it's abundantly clear that they are. Yeah, I do think, though, there's, like there's a certain life cycle, right? And I think
you're chalking this up to like immaturity, aren't you?
Yeah, kind of, but also not necessarily the maturity of the girls, but the maturity of their relationships, right? So it's like these are guys who probably want to like keep their girlfriends, right? Who are just sort of, one bad move away from like losing. Like I don't know what these girls will like, catch it.
Good Christian girls,
good
of course.
Christian girls. All right, so I don't know if they would have been perceived by like their boyfriends as like, they're punching above or below their weight, whatever. But yeah, like I mean, it's if they are happy with the status quo, they're willing to put into the relationship, right? And that's
true.
That's just like, yeah.
I'm going to cap off this segment just by one last memory that I have personally witnessed around the crying dynamic, and this was again, actually, this was outside work. We were with a group of people actually, and we could see this kind of like exchange between what seemed to be quite, like maybe in their 30s now, so a bit older, so good case study, and the wife was kind of like complaining. She was venting about her day and saying that, it's so stressful and this person's breathing down my back and babe, I'm not eating well and like my mum's like on my back to do all this stuff and I'm not doing enough for her and all this kind of stuff. And she starts like getting teary, and I could almost see the man's or the husband's kind of thought process in real time. It was like, how do I respond to this? And he had like his little decision tree around, okay, do I hug? Do I go, oh, yes, dear, it sucks, and that stuff. He chose like this really extreme branch of the tree that said, no, I'm going to treat this like a PT, saying, give me one more. And just like, it's going to be one of those occasions where I snap her out of it and I actually solve this whole thing. I nip it in the bud. And he had this snap and I could just see it. I could see the look in his eyes and he's just like, babe, you're upset over nothing. You've got it so good. And I just like doubled down on her and just being like, stop being a pussy. Like, stop crying. Like, you've got it so good. You've got everything you want and you're doing so well. And she just burst into tears. He totally fucked it. And it was like, she was wanting a bit of tenderness and he was like, I'm going to give you some tough love and maybe you'll snap out of it. And she did not. And she just like cried so hard.
But just to be fair to this guy and that approach, right, there is a role for that, such as in the situation where these girls cry about getting in, I don't know, in trouble is probably patronizing, but like,
yeah.
And you know what? It's the equivalent of like when you're shedding a tear in the final act of Les Miserables and you're crying and like you're afraid that the person next to you will see that you're shedding a tear. The internal voice in your head just says, snap out of it, you pussy, like snap out now. Like, what are you crying for?
You know which musical does that in the most masterful way? It's Hamilton. And in those kind of things where he loses his son and stuff, and then the marriage breaks down and all the stuff and the cheating. And then after all that stuff and the crowd's crying, literally the next song is like, can we get back to politics, please? And they just like, the song just like snaps back into a totally like different view. And it's that kind of lifts everyone back up. And that kind of is that similar thing of what you're talking about. All right. We spent way too long talking about women crying in their 20s. Let's hit a listener question really quickly. I believe it's my turn to surprise you. Hey, Andy and Roger. I'm a 20-year-old guy who just started listening to your podcast on a friend's recommendation. In your recent episode, you talked a lot about cultural norms and how people from different backgrounds might act in public spaces. Like that story about the car park incident. Honestly, though, I think you guys are missing the mark on understanding a modern society and the younger generation. We live in a world where global cultures blend more than ever. The old norms are constantly being challenged and redefined. How can you claim to even have an understanding of what's right and wrong in today's diverse society when it seems like you're clinging to outdated perspectives? Curious to hear your thoughts, Jake.
This sounds like a moral relativist to me.
He's the first person to leave like a proper name, though.
Well, thank you, Jake, for listening. 20 years old, I must admit, that's a very sophisticated question. I kind of empathize with what you're saying because like that's kind of partially what I was saying in the actual episode. I think what we were trying to say is there is like an objectively right thing, or at least a more objectively right thing to do in the context of like the system in Australia and the culture of Australia, in much the same way as if you're using an Apple computer, there's certain keyboard shortcuts to use for the Apple computer, and you've got to use those shortcuts on the Apple computer, not the ones from Windows, right? And
why do you always have to bring Apples into it?
And And so there's a certain set of like things that make things work, our society in Australia work efficiently and properly. And if those rules don't get followed, even if they're okay and they're not objectively the best rules, but it could be that there's better rules in another country, but like that's because everyone's following those same rules. But we follow the rules here, and that's how it all works. But yeah, I'm not 100% sold on the like notion that there's no truth, there's no like objective reality, or we can't start to sort of talk about like this thing is bad, because like if you can't say something is objectively bad, then you don't have much to anchor your view of the world in for anything, right? So, for example, if we say killing children and torturing them before their death is bad, objectively bad, then we don't have much like solid ground to stand on for anything, right? And of course, that's an extreme example, but like, you know, we can, if we can say something fairly solid in one space, we can extrapolate and give ourselves some solid ground in other topics. So I think in the context of culture, I think you can, you know, maybe say, well, if you care about, let's say, economic growth, then these cultural traits are objectively better for the purpose of achieving economic growth. But if you don't care about economic growth, then that's when you might care about a different value. So, and that kind of changes the game. But either way, whatever you do care about and value, you can come up with some more solid and objective statements about the world.
Jakey. I feel Andy's gone very easy on you. And only because he's made some points that talk about relativism. And I don't even think it was relativism that you were talking about. You were just more the cultural context of the way things are. Look, I think this, what do they say? Live and let live. And I think the core thing that underlies that is that you can do what you want in this world. And I don't care. Do whatever you want to do. Don't hurt other people. Right? And it's that second kind of line, part of the sentence that you need to think about. Right? So understand that the problem I have with this line of thinking is that on one hand, this type of thought kind of says every culture has its own value. Tick. Yeah, that sounds good. Motherhood statement. I love culture. And who are you to judge any culture from being outside that culture? Tick. I kind of get it. But what it misses is like when you apply that same logic around your own culture, you fundamentally believe that your progressive values today are better than your ancestral values, whether it be slavery, colonial behavior, whatever it is. So you only have to go that far in your reasoning to understand that there are better outcomes and values than others. So, and I think that that's what you should reflect on, Jake. Like, I think that if you truly believe that what's right and wrong, I'm sure that you also believe that I don't know if you're American, Australian, or whatever, take any kind of Western country, that you don't have to look back very far in our history to recognize that the value set that we have now in the same country, in the same culture, is superior because it impacts and it hurts less people. So that would be my response to you. Oh, okay. And one final thing, just to inflame you, would you be able to say firmly that female circumcision is wrong, still practiced today in countries and cultures in Africa and different diaspora? Maybe that's a good dinner time conversation to have, mulling this over. But thank you for the question.
Well, Jake's not here to answer the question, so yeah, let's shall we move on?
Let's move on.
Okay, so we're going to talk about our episode today is on the humble book and books and reading and all that stuff. Promise you it won't be boring. It sounds boring. Just to kick this off, give me a snapshot of your current reading habits, practices, as of maybe like as of now, but maybe contrast them to like previous periods of your life.
All right. Well, I'm going to start off with a bit of a story. So everyone in my family, and even my extended family, like 100% of them, have terrible eyesight. They all wear glasses and contacts and things like that. And I am the only one that does not. And I've always accredited that to the fact that I didn't read much as a kid. So I didn't wear my eyes out, or reading in poor conditions and becoming short-sighted or whatever it was. And that's always the running joke in my family, because I'm the only one that doesn't, to this day, looking down the barrel at 40, has never had to wear glasses. So I will profess of not being an avid reader growing up. I have built that up more as I've become a bit more mature. But I would still say that when it comes to books, I don't read anywhere near as much as I would like to. And in fact, my bookshelf, so to speak, is relatively small, right? And I've always found it as a very inefficient way to consume information. And I've been very slow to the party to find enjoyment in fiction books. So I'll kind of put myself out there as someone who has kind of been dragged kicking and screaming into literature in that way. But now in my later years have a much, greater appreciation for it. And I do really enjoy books now. Yeah.
Can I ask you, your bookcase, your bookshelf, the titles on the book, like, okay, so like a lot of people have, it's like the classic during the pandemic, like the Zoom bookcase, bookshelf, right? In the background, as the backdrop, where everyone would show off how learned they are, and all the, almost a signal of who they are as a person based on which books they've got on their bookshelf. But a lot of those bookshelves, I feel, were somewhat ornamental as opposed to the books being read. So when
the Grand Britannica Encyclopedia.
Oh no, but they're not useful because they don't say anything, right? It's just too generic, right? You need like the, Barack Obama, A Promised Land, to signal that you're a Democrat, and you need the, or whatever. Yeah, what percentage of your bookshelf would you say you've actually read versus like on display for more ornamental or maybe even aspirational value?
Yeah, I have my version of that. So, and because I've been moving around so much in the last few years, I don't really have a bookcase. But when I did have a bookcase, and when I think about what's in the boxes and everything, my percentages are very, very high of what I have read. So I think I've read about 80% of my books. And I would say that out of the remaining 20%, I would like to read 10%, the half of that. And there's just another half that I know that I will never, ever read. For example, I do have a copy, like a first generation copy of Stephen Hawking's kind of like his famous A Brief History of Time. So that was definitely an aspirational book that I, as soon as I read the first part, I'm like, I'm never reading this. I'm just never reading it. But I do have quite an eclectic taste in books. And I think one thing that I have really struggled with is fiction. And I think that most people that I know that are bookworms and really consume a lot of books, they have a really deep love of fiction. And that's something that I've struggled to find.
Yeah, well, okay, so on the bookshelf, I think, okay, well, let me just give my book story, my reading story. Like, I've never, ever in my whole life enjoyed reading a physical book. Like, I've never enjoyed it, never gotten into it, never done it, basically. And still to this day, never done it. I do not read books, full stop, period. In fact, like, I don't get books really in some ways because there's this like really archaic way of like consuming information. You've got like this heavy, like, I don't know, like I don't know how much a book weighs, but let's say, 300-400 gram thing that you carry around with you. It takes up space, combine a few books together. They're really heavy. It's like really awkward. Like, how do you I'm just thinking, like, how do you relax while you've got to like have this heavy lumpy thing on you? So I've never gotten into it, like, frankly.
I think our listeners would find that quite shocking.
So there's, apart from like the inconveniences of like carrying like a physical book around, there's also the fact that I don't think I'm quite a slow reader. So I think people who enjoy reading tend to read fast. And I'm not sure if that's because they've trained themselves to do that, or it's practice, or it's for whatever the combination of factors are. But like virtually all of the most prolific readers can read really fast. Like, they can chew through books.
I'm calling bullshit though. And the reason I say that is that, so I feel exactly the same way as you. I feel like I read at a snail's pace. And I often, if I'm reading something of value, I often have to read it again to absorb it properly, the complicated stuff. And then I know lots of people who are proper bookworms and they read very, very fast. So if you're reading the same thing as them, they obviously they finish, they're ready to turn the page before you are. But you ask them to give you details of the book they just read and nothing sticks. So my conclusion actually is that while there might be some minor variances in the ability to kind of like train your eyes to read and process or whatever it is, I actually think they're just skimming the book.
Well, okay, so let me give... Okay, I have some perspectives on this, right? And this relates to the second half of my story, which is that whilst I don't read physical books, I love audiobooks. So I really, really like, in fact, like it's one of the top things in my life, right? This is like a relatively like new thing, right? Because, audiobooks weren't that common even 10 years ago. But definitely, I can't remember when, but maybe like 5 years ago, I was like, I really want to like read this book. Like there was a particular book I wanted to read. I always read stuff, like I read stuff online and different things, but just not books, right?
Yeah.
But then I knew there was this book, this one particular book that I wanted to read, and I bought the book. I had the physical book in my hands. I was like, I really need to read this thing. I was like, oh God, it's like, but then I came up against the brick wall of all those challenges we just talked about, like slow reading, and it just wasn't working for me. I mean, I just knew it would just be painful to get through it, right? And then I thought, see this like Audible thing, right? I can go and get the audiobook of it. I'll actually give that a try and like see if that's easier. But the thing that I found, and this was absolutely the game changer for me, and this is why I love audiobooks so much. Well, there's two reasons. The first is it solves the slow reading problem, because I listen at usually between 1.5 and 2 times speed, depending on like the nature of the book and like, is it something where I really need to pick up on details or not, or I can just get the general gist of it. So it means like a book that it would take me hours and hours and hours to read. It's much quicker. And so that's the first. And I actually felt like I even understood, like absorbed it even better.
The comprehension, yeah.
Yeah, it was actually like, it wasn't worse comprehension. Like you can't track back and say, what was that thing again? Hang on. Like, so it's a little bit different to the physical book. So that's the first advantage. And the second is like, of course, you can listen to audiobooks while you're doing other things, like while you're driving a car or, certainly while you're commuting, you can, on the train or whatever. But while you're cooking, you can listen to an audiobook. So the list, like listening is just unlocked this new thing. And then since that time, like I've just absorbed so many books. And so I guess this leads to my next question for you is it cheating to listen to an audiobook? And is that truly reading? Is that truly like reading a book? Like, can you say listening to an audiobook, is it the same? Like, should I be able to say in the past 5 years I've read whatever number of books that I've read? Or am I kind of cheating if I said that?
Yeah. Look, I think we're quite similar in that way, right? That it taps into something very deep in terms of we, as humans, have obviously had a oral story, like narrative tradition, right? We've got an oral history tradition. And we like hearing things, and even it's like something that harks back from being a kid, right? Like you like people reading books to you, and I understand it. But I also think that I can understand why someone who is an avid reader would say, no, that doesn't count, because there is something about this process of turning the pages, of holding the text, and having your mind process it. And I know if you talk to someone who's really into fiction, they talk about this whenever they see a movie, right? Which I know audiobooks in between that, but it's kind of, that's what I mean. It's in between the book and the movie in some ways, right? Because you still have to imagine it, but you're being told it, right? Like you're being fed it with a different voice, a different pace, a different thing. And it's just like something, I think there is something about reading the text and making your mind do the processing work to do the imagination and keeping track of the characters and all sorts of different things. So I think there's the argument there, but at the end of the day, does it matter? That, like, obviously not, because you wouldn't have been able to consume all these books if it weren't for audiobooks, right? So I think at the end of the day, whatever, a little bit of sugar makes the pill go down, right? And I'm all for that. Why make it an unpleasant experience? I have a really strange relationship with audiobooks, because you know what the first audiobook I ever listened to was? Take a guess.
The Bible.
The Bible, 100%. So when I was a kid, and obviously it's very hard to read the Bible as a child. So what they do is they make audiobooks, and they have all this like insidious kind of like characters with turtles and anamorphized things that kind of essentially recreate the fables of the Old Testament. Sorry, not fables, but you know what I mean. And yeah, so I have this really kind of like horrible. I remember I still have some of the cassettes where they teach these like heavy-handed morals using like turtles and animals and sheep and stuff, and they were awful. It was a really unpleasant experience even as a child. And so I remember listening to that as a child, and like did you ever listen to any audiobooks as a kid, like in cars, like road trips or anything like that?
No. In fact, the first audiobook that I listened to would have been that book that I actually told you about just before, right? 5 years ago or so ago.
Yeah, look, I'm the same way, and I do get it. I guess the thing I would say though is, like, even just being fair, we've listened to quite a few audiobooks last year to prepare for the podcast. And let me take like a specific example. Say like the ones that we only listen to because of the topic, like white privilege, or why I'm no longer talking to white people about race. Can you honestly say that you remember much of it?
Well, I don't think that's any different from like whether you read it or you listened to it. Like, I think generally you remember the sketch of the key points and ideas. You don't remember detail. We're not trained to remember, like our brains don't work to like remember, page 37 said this very specific story that went like this. Like it's the general vibe that at the time we synthesize that we remember, right? I don't buy that bit before where you said like people who read books like would say, oh no, it's not the same. I think that's bullshit, right? I think
you don't think they would say that, because they do.
Oh no. I'm sure they say it, but I think they're bullshit, right? I think they've got their view is bullshit, right? Because that to me is like a very pretentious kind of view of like it's the equivalent of like people who, oh, you're not really into music unless you use super audio CDs or something, right? It's that kind of, you need to have it this way, otherwise you're
it's
not
the
good enough, right?
Of it all.
And I think with like audiobooks, there's no evidence that retention is more if you read it on a page versus listen to it. In fact, like there's studies to look at this actual question, and that basically that say there's no difference. Like it's the same. The only difference that you can like observe is that for some things, like yes, you can't like go back and look at the
reference.
Like you can't go back and forth, right? I mean, and you can, and you can go back and re-listen to stuff, but if the way you're reading the book is just straight, like you just read it and you're happy to concede that you missed that thing, so you're not going to like spend like a minute, fixated on that one thing, like, and you just roll through it, then there's no difference, right? And I should say, like I mentioned, like I've listened to a lot of audiobooks. I still am yet to download or listen to a single fiction audiobook. So all of my books are non-fiction. And I think maybe another angle here that we should explore.
Yeah, I'm going to go into, I'm not surprised, right? Like, and I honestly feel like if you lined up 10 guys randomly on the street, I think 8 of them, maybe even 9 of them, would have similar stories, right? And I kind of want to go there for a second. That I do think that reading is one of the areas of life and upbringing that there are meaningful differences between the sexes. And it does come out in different surveys. Men read less. They definitely read less fiction. And yeah, it seems to be so number one, I just want to hit you with that. Do you agree with that initial premise? that men read less and read less fiction than women.
I think that's statistically a truth, isn't it? That
Yeah.
and this is, I guess I remember saying this in the workplace. Actually, I presented this. I can't remember what the context was, but I remember saying something like, "Well, like when we talk about, let's say, I don't know, podcasts, right? And we talk about podcast guests, right? Usually, the podcast ecosystem is like geared off the back of like people who've written books trying to promote their books, right? So when you have like certain podcasts which are, they're not like a book club with Julie sort of thing. They're like, no, this is like, conversations with Tyler where he's going to ask you all of these like really technical, questions. Like he's going to have like on average more men on his podcast just because there are these, and because that goes for authors as well, right? For better or worse. And there are, and so that does create these like then second order, like, discrepancies between like having male guests versus female guests. And it is a statistically true figure. Now, that doesn't mean you have anything to say about why that's the case. And you can definitely say, oh, it's totally consistent with like a, I don't know, a feminist view of the world to say, well, the only reason men decide that they want to read, non-fiction versus fiction is because men, like, that's them fulfilling like a sense of identity, that they're like, the know-it-alls who, the smartest person in the room, and the women are stupid, and that's, there's role play. Like, you could say that, right? That could be that, like a hot take on that topic, right? But yeah, I mean, I think statistically it's a truism, right? Isn't it?
Well, it's definitely, this is one where I actually feel it's fairly safe to wade out there into international waters and claim the data backs it up, and anecdotally, like, your lived experience backs it up. And I would be pretty comfortable betting my hand on that is the case, right? Now, the interesting thing, I guess, is why, and I think that's why the rise of podcasts and some YouTube channels and online channels have attracted a lot of men's and male-dominated issues, and sometimes not in a very good way, is because they're filling this gap. Like, just because men don't love to read in a kind of traditional sense, doesn't mean that they don't like to partake in a lot of these, like the sharing of ideas and stuff. And in some ways, I feel like if you switch it over to, say, debate clubs and stuff like that, they would be dominated by men. Right?
Do you know, like, just talking about podcasts for a second, like, I'm not sure what the numbers are when it comes to podcasts, like between consumption, like male versus female consumers of podcasts. If men do consume more podcasts than women, like, I actually don't know that. But one thing I definitely notice is it's like vast differences in the types of podcasts that men listen to versus the types of podcasts women listen to, and like it's like a foreign universe to me when I read if I read like an article written by, like, on a Sydney Morning Herald article or something like that, and they're like, oh, and it's written by like a female journalist, and it's talking you through like, oh, these are the best podcasts of the year or something, or 10 podcasts you must check out or whatever. I read through the list and I'm like, what the hell alternate planet did I just land on? Like, there's no way I would listen to any of these. And it's not just that they're like, traditional girly topics like flower making with Pam or something, it's just a different universe.
Well, look, Andy, for a long time, I think the most popular TV show in the world was 2.5 Men, right? So there you have it. Like, do not be led astray by the most popular anything, and expect that it's going to be fulfilling or have the quality that you're looking for, right? But I guess that's the whole thing about entertainment versus, I mean, books, right? Like, the other thing to be said about books is that you know, back in the day, do you remember back in the day going into something like Gowings? Or what's that really big one that we had where it was one of the first ones where a bookstore almost became like a place to hang out and had like cafe or coffee.
Was it Borders?
Borders. Oh my God. I used to love Borders, right? And I didn't even love books. And because it's this place that you could go to, which was like a cafe / weird library. Everyone fucks up all the books but never buys anything. and which is eventually why they closed down anyway. But it was kind of cool because it was just like another. It was like another environment to explore as a young person, right? And one that was like felt healthy in some way, right? Like this idea of being surrounded by knowledge. But what I would say is that when you look at the true breadth of a big bookstore and you walk around, you tend to realize that like books are just like any other media. It can be about anything and everything, and not all of it is valuable. In fact, very little of it is probably valuable at the end of the day, right? Like you are what you eat, and you can consume the trashiest of the trash, and you can also consume, philosophy and classical literature and all sorts of other things if you want. And like, there's something for everyone. There really is. And I guess it's just whether that medium attracts you. Because coming back to like retention, data retention, you talk about like reading books, whether it's through audio or the physical book, and not retaining information. I can still remember actual scenes from the movies that I've watched as a kid. You know what I mean? Like there is no challenge in my mind that multimedia, or specifically videos, movies, are a superior data retention for humans, right? And I think that we haven't kind of gotten around that in terms of education as well.
Yeah, but Roger, that's only because you watched The Blue Lagoon 20 times.
No, it was more Wild Things for me growing up. But seriously, like you think of the memories you have as kids. This is how the brain works. We have visions. We have a projector on the wall, like moving scenes. We don't have words into like some weird cloud and memories of details and facts and reference. Like we're not a terminal to store data. We remember things in pictures.
All right. So hypothetical, one of your relatives, let's just say that they're in the boomer generation, decides that like a good birthday present for you would be a $50 gift voucher to Dimmicks, which is a very famous bookstore in Australia. And there's only, let's say you go to, I don't know, there must be only like a handful of Dimmicks available nowadays, but you're in the city one. Let's just say you're the biggest one where you've got as much choice as you could possibly have. You're in this bookstore. How do you decide what book to buy with your $50 gift voucher?
Look, if it's just a book, keep in mind that Dimmicks knows that they're facing a losing battle and they sell everything now.
You can't buy salt shakers or anything like that.
You can buy anything from Dimmicks now. If it has to be a book, and look, you're going to go straight to the top, right? And straight to the top is Goodreads, the app, right? When it comes to books, you're going to go to Goodreads, where the serious community of book readers go, and book lovers go, right? And I think that they have captured that market, right? And I think that you can reliably look at the ratings on Goodreads. And in fact, if you do read a lot of the ratings on Goodreads, it's probably the finest example of peer-to-peer review that you can see in terms of quality. Like when you think about what else is out there on Airbnb and Google reviews and all that stuff, I think that actually, review for review, quality pound for pound, it's the best. Like you read them and you can tell that these are readers. They know how to write. They know how to construct a paragraph. It's very rarely you come up with like just the real like chavvy review that's just like, this book was so gay, like this. You never have that. It's always like quite good, like because everyone fancies themselves as book club people, right? And so I trust Goodreads, right? And I know that you can kind of rely on those ratings to a degree. Now, what you can't do, and I've been fooled before, is trick yourself into thinking you like a book. And I think that that's the really hard thing when it comes to search for a book. It's like, it's kind of like a good film sometimes, like a highly rated film, but the person who rates the film doesn't have your taste, right? So it's good. It's going to be good, well written, blah, 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 but you're not going to like it because the stuffy, Oscars judge who rated that movie isn't really in tune with what you like and what you enjoy.
Well, more importantly, I mean, usually that scenario is because you're not the audience that the book's written for. So, in the context of books, it might be that it's like an academic book or something.
Yeah, but it is really hard to tell. And of course, like there are some books that you buy just because of the physical beauty of the book. So I would say that we're thinking of books quite narrowly here in terms of like fiction, non-fiction, text-based books. But like, for example, one of the things I love collecting almost, and I have spent an enormous amount of time looking over, are cookbooks. Like cookbooks are very, very valuable, and they're beautiful, and they're like an intergenerational, I mean, they used to be, probably not so much now, but they're like an intergenerational store of wisdom in a very condensed kind of view, like in the same way that like medicine formulas would be passed down back in the day. Invaluable, right? So I kind of have a real soft spot for those kind of books that are just like, like a beautifully bound cookbook, right? It has this kind of intrinsic value to me that within this book, you might never, it's a good example actually, because you might never, it's like its own mini bookshelf. You buy this beautiful cookbook, you might cook 5% of the recipes in this cookbook, but you don't care. You just want the book. You want the ability to have access to it. And maybe that's a good way to think about a bookshelf. Like it's actually, the power is in having the chronicle, not actually exercising the chronicle. What do you think?
So Goodreads is, for me, definitely the go-to. However, I would not use that as like the tool to work out what to read. I would predominantly get like a lead of some like, and actually podcasts are like for me the top lead, right? So I'll listen to a podcast and I go, oh, that guy was interesting. He's promoting a book or he's talking about a book. I'll listen to that book because it was an interesting conversation, right? It's a teaser of what it's about. The other scenario that might come up is like there might be something going on, like an interest that I have at any point in time, and I'll be like, I want to know more about that topic, and I'll go down like a rabbit warren where I want to read as many books about one topic as possible, and then what I'll do is that's when I'll rely on Goodreads. So I'll go, okay, I'll type into Goodreads. I don't know, like what I had this period where I want to know more about Singapore. Like I want to know more about its history. Like I want to know more about Singapore in general, right? The history of it, how it came to be, all that sort of stuff. And
I think there's a travel guide book on it that I'll buy you for your birthday.
Well, the book that I ended up reading was I found it through Goodreads. And there's not that many books on Singapore, right? Generally, like there's not a lot of books on the history of Singapore, or that give the tale. I mean, Singapore's a pretty new country, right? So go figure. But anyway, so and it had, I could find the book. I could see it was like a good one. It had a high rating and so on. The other scenario would be, like I said, I'll listen to a podcast and there'll be a guest on and there'll be a book and it sounds interesting. I will use Goodreads to just double check that it is the book is interesting.
It's not a tourist trap.
Yeah. So for me with Goodreads, I have like values, right? I have standards, right? So I will not listen to an audiobook if it has like, okay, so under 3 is like a hard no matter what. The lowest that I would like to go is 3.5. I wouldn't like to, I don't like to go below 3.5, but I would listen to a 3.5 book if I know that there's a reason why it's might be like, if there's a mitigating reason. So it could be that like
it's about Nazis.
Well, it could be a couple of things. It could be that the topic is so interesting and I really want to, like, it might be a shit book, but like the subject matter is so interesting to me that I don't care if it's a shit book, but like the topic is, I just want to know about that topic.
For anyone who just tuned in, we're talking about books, not women here.
Or it could be, like you said, a scenario where, I don't know, it might be like a Ben Shapiro book or something where it's like there's just going to be people rating him down, like the culture wars of it. And it might be like it might be rated poorly because he's equally biased in his book or whatever and ideological in his book, but I still want to be exposed to that I want to hear his argument. Like, even if I'm not going to agree with it, I want to hear it so I know about it. So that might be a scenario but otherwise for everything else, like 4 is like minimum.
All right. I like it. But, and I think maybe we've exposed a gap in the market that we should move into in the middle, which is a Goodreads app, but for podcast episodes. There's nothing really for that. So that could be a good little project, really. But I'm going to ask you to, there is a book that's very dear to both of us called Spare by Prince Harry and a ghostwriter, many ghostwriters probably. What is your guess of the Goodreads rating of Spare currently in January 2024?
I reckon I think there's like what's the word, confirmation bias sort of type thing happening. Like, I think people who would read Spare or buy Spare would generally have some fondness for Prince Harry. And anyone who doesn't have fondness for Prince Harry would avoid it like the plague. So I'm going to say it is relatively higher rated than what it deserves. If I was personally going to rate it, I would give it. I'd give it like at least a 3, just to recognize it as a book. Because most of the reason I would like mark it down is the content, like the things that are said, and like just the sheer arrogance and pretentious, or kind of tone deafness of it all. But yeah, I would probably say, to be fair, probably a 3.25 to 3.5 maybe. But I reckon it's rated higher than that. I reckon it's either around 4 or possibly even above 4.
All right. So currently in January 2024, it has almost 330,000 ratings and 36,000 actual reviews. And it is landing a 3.87 at the moment. So you're kind of right, almost at 4, which is pretty remarkable, I think, with given the situation.
All right. So do you give Goodreads ratings yourself?
No, I've always thought that I would, but I haven't. No, I haven't actually got into that culture. I think you need to break down your first few, and I just have never really taken that first step.
Do you give, sorry, not reviews, but ratings, like where you give it the... So
no, I actually haven't.
So I've kind of stopped doing it, but for a time I was keeping track of every book I've read via Goodreads.
How can you do it though, Andy? Like tracking it obviously, but
or listen to.
How do you actually do like the 3 versus the 4? Like, how do you? I don't know.
I see. I kind of wanted the Goodreads, like my library, as I think there's something innate to human instincts to collect like what knowledge you've been exposed to, right? And the bookshelf with the books on it, it's the most visible signal of like, these are all of my books, right? And when you listen to audiobooks, you don't have that. You don't have a bookshelf. It's like this, you have this empty thing with Lego, figurines on it, right? Yeah. And so for me, the Goodreads like bookshelf is like my way of like, yes, this is what I've read. This is my interest, and maybe it helps it like Goodreads make recommendations to me as well. But I did get like, I haven't updated it since September 27, 2023. So last year. So I have to get up to date.
A bit of journaling to do. I don't know, like some of this conversation today, I think you could throw in just strip it back to a general conversation around the value of analog methods versus digital, like generally, right? Because a lot of these same things play out in that way. You were talking about Dimmicks and what you would do with $50, and something that came to mind was, I'd probably buy some stationery. But you're in the same spot. Is like, what is the value of buying pens and paper anymore versus not? And this idea, they always say that if you write something in a textbook, you absorb it more than just reading it. And I guess there's this thing going on that this reckoning around analog and digital that we are facing into, And there's lots of different versions of that we've touched on throughout the year around work from home versus working virtually versus in the office. That's an analog digital thing. When the dying art of someone, writing, having a presence in a meeting, scribing with a whiteboard marker, and how impressive that can be when it's done really well with a lot of skill and a lot of finesse versus, someone putting a slide up on the screen. Like there's all this kind of dying art of like analog versus digital that I do, it's not just our age, I think, that has nostalgia for it. I think there is something there that we will lose if we're not careful around this kind of the art of doing something by pen and paper.
Yeah, it's the same with like the collecting vinyls thing, right? And
yeah.
Do you know, like, I don't know, maybe this is like the height of like pandemic hubris when we all had money and more dollars and cents because like the government was splashing cash around, low interest rates and all that sort of stuff. But I had
those who held on to their job.
Yeah, well, that's true. But I had this like period where, and we're all homebound. So that was like, I just kept looking at this like bookcase and I'm like, there's no books in it. And I'm like, well, what books do I buy? Like, I don't want to buy books. Okay, well, I've got to buy books like to fill the bookcase, but like, what books do I buy, right? Do I buy like books that I won't read by virtue of the fact that I don't read books? Or do I buy books that I have read or via audiobook, almost as like, I'm going to like duplicate my audiobook library in physical books just to fill the bookcase as like an ornament in the house as more than anything else. And it was just like such a stupid thing to do. But I did buy some books that I'd read by audiobook. In fact, you know what? It got so ridiculous that I'd forgotten which ones I'd bought, and I bought one book twice.
Oh, no. That would have really burnt you up. I actually like this, again, I've like sparked another business idea for us to do, which is like a service that analyzes your Audible bookshelf or your Goodreads bookshelf. And instead of ordering all the real books, it actually prints you ornamental books for your bookshelf.
Oh, like
that actually looks like the spine of them and the actual thing.
Oh, yeah. Like
and
the
it
old,
just like makes it all.
Like the old fake, when you used to like tape a movie off the TV and then you just print off
print the jacket.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is actually quite a clever idea for people who want to have like a mock library and show like all the books, like a replica of all the books, right? And obviously it doesn't cost as much as buying a book. It's a fraction of the price, but it recreates your history. I think people would be into that.
I mean, it's such a good analogy for how vacuous our lives have become. Like these empty books with no knowledge, like retained, like just empty.
Yeah, but I mean, like, also, do you have, finally, just to wrap up, I think, do you have attitudes around what kind of relationship you want to foster in terms of reading with your son? Because I think that's where you're faced with a bit of trade-off. Because I know personally, even though I have not found a love of books early on in my life, it's something that inexplicably, I want to kind of pass on to my kids in this weird, misguided way of like wanting them to do something that I think I should have done. But then when I really think about it, it's like, is it still valuable? And I just kind of get mixed up sometimes around this. It's so linked, this idea of an academic achiever with a good reader. You know, like this avid reader is someone who's knowledgeable, who has a pursuit for learning, who's, academic. That is hard to break that link. But because when I think about what I want my kids to do, I want them to be avid readers.
Okay, I think time and time again, parents make the same mistake, whatever we're talking about, whether it's music, whether it's sporting interests, whether it's books, to think that as a parent, you can instill in your child a passion for the thing that you're passionate about, or in what you've just outlined, think that they should be passionate about. You can't do it. They have to develop it themselves. Like, if you don't expose them to books, then of course they're never going to develop a passion for it. So in that's probably what you can do. It's a bit like, fishing. Like some kids might really love fishing, but they're never going to know if they like fishing unless they're fisherman father takes them
take 'em
fishing,
fishing.
right? Like, so, but I guess with books, it might be that, but like, I don't know. I kind of feel like books are dying as well because, even like a lot of the podcasts I listen to, these are people who've written books themselves. And often the comment they make is like, why would I bother writing a book? Like, I just, and their guests say the same thing. They say, like, it's far easier just to do podcasts because, like, first of all, I've got a much bigger audience. Second of all, like, there's no money in books. And like, why would I spend, like, what is the value of writing a book to express ideas that I can, when I can do it more efficiently via podcasts?
I think there's still
Or
something
essays.
very, very appealing about saying that you are a published author. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, but you only need to do that once, right? It's like being a father, right? You didn't get the memo on that one.
No. Yeah.
So my final question for you, maybe a bit of a roadie for our listeners. Give me a book recommendation, preferably a more recent book, like not necessarily like a classic or anything, but like a more like a book that you think like our listener base would kind of be interested in, and maybe something that they might not otherwise know about.
Yeah, this is a tough one because the kind of books that I've read recently have been for the episodes. I want to shy away from that and give a more kind of like foundational book. Now, I know in the New Year's episode I talked about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I do strongly recommend that for anyone who has never read it. Great read. Okay, so the book I'm going to go is very foundational for me. It's Sophie's World by Justine Garda, who it's actually a book that's written between a philosophy teacher and a fictional student, and it kind of plays out in letters, and then it kind of goes through the different kind of history of philosophy. But it's done in such a clever way. It's done in such an entertaining and digestible way that I think that if you've always liked the idea of philosophy, but you've never known where to start, this is just a gem. It's like it puts it in a really playful, lighthearted, fictional way that sneaks the knowledge in. It's like the vegetables in the bolognese, right? Like it gets in there in a really pleasurable way. And then that launches, and for me especially, at the time I read it, it launched a love of finding out more about these different philosophers and exploring some of their core ideas in a very accessible way that I wouldn't have got if I just picked up, a book on Plato and stuff like that, right? It's actually a really, really good way if you are someone who's interested but finds it very, a bit kind of scary, a bit intimidating to go into. And if you listen to the middle, I think that the listener base, you either already into general philosophy or you are susceptible to finding out more. So I'm gonna go with that. Sophie's World.
Okay.
Have you got one?
I'll take a different approach to you. I won't recommend one with a detailed explanation. I'll recommend, so what I've done on air is I've gone to Goodreads and I've looked at my 5-star books, and I've got a few 5-star books, but there's a like little cluster in time from around 2018, 19 where I'm just looking through. I was scrolling down my 5 stars, like, oh yeah, they were really good books. So I'm just going to list them. I'm not going to say anything about them. I'm just going to name the book. And so Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense by Rory Sutherland. Life 3.0, Being a Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence by Max Tegmark. The Case Against Education, Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money by Brian Kaplan. And How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence by Michael Pollan.
Yeah, that's a really good list for kind of modern thinking, I think.
Yeah.
I would actually hazard a guess that if you read all of those books, you'd probably be familiar with like 80% of the podcast in the last year. Seriously, I think that a lot of those themes you could construct, maybe throw in Sapiens and maybe one atheism book, and you'd have like 85% of like podcast topics.
Well, right now I'm reading a book about pizza, so yeah, it's really gone downhill.
All right.
All right, over and out.